When you think of Genghis Khan, what comes to mind? A fierce warrior, a brilliant general, the man who built the largest land empire in history. This is about the millions who had no choice. The men, women, and children captured, stripped of their names, their families, and their freedom, and turned into tools for the Mongol war machine. So, how did one become a slave in the Mongol Empire? It was terrifyingly simple. When the Mongol army arrived at a city, they offered a choice: surrender unconditionally or face total destruction. Every person and every possession in a conquered city that fought back belonged to the Khan and his army. First, the population would be forced out of the city into an open plain. For a slave, the smallest act of defiance could mean death. Trying to escape was an automatic death sentence, not just for the slave, but often for anyone who helped him. A Mongol who gave a runaway slave food or shelter would be executed alongside them. There was no mercy. The Mongol family you served watched your every move. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The vast, open steppes that were a symbol of freedom for the Mongols became an endless prison for their captives. It was a psychological prison as much as a physical one. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Genghis Khan's rule over his slaves was his cold, calculated pragmatism. He didn't see them as people. He saw them as resources. Once the artisans were selected and the human shields were organized, what about the rest? The elderly, the sick, the very young, or anyone deemed useless, were simply executed. This system of slavery and terror was the engine that powered the Mongol Empire. The empire wasn't just built on the strength of its army. It was built on the broken backs and shattered lives of millions of nameless slaves. Great centers of learning, like the libraries of Baghdad, were destroyed. Their scholars killed or enslaved. The world was permanently scarred. Yes, he was a military visionary, but he was also a master of terror and the architect of one of the most brutal systems of slavery the world has ever seen. To understand why Genghis Khan treated slaves with such brutal indifference, you have to look beyond the man and at the world he created. The Mongol Empire wasn't built on stone foundations or sprawling farmlands. It was an empire on the move, a nation of nomads living in felt tents, following the herds and the seasons across the unforgiving vastness of the Eurasian steppe. Life here was a constant struggle. Winters were merciless, food was scarce, and survival depended on strength, discipline, and a complete rejection of weakness. This harsh reality forged the Mongol people into who they were: resilient, pragmatic, and incredibly tough. This same unforgiving spirit was the bedrock of the Mongol army, the most terrifying and effective military machine of its time. Discipline wasn't just encouraged, it was absolute. The army was organized in units of 10, a system called the Arban. If one soldier in an Arban deserted in battle, the other 9 were executed. If the entire Arban fled, the whole unit of 100, the Jagan, would be put to the sword. Loyalty wasn't a noble ideal. It was a matter of survival. An order from a superior was not a suggestion. For a general to disobey a command from the Khan was unthinkable, a crime that could lead to the execution of not just him, but his entire family line. There was no room for sentiment, no space for individual desires. The will of the Khan was law, and the price of defiance was death. This worldview, shaped by the steppe and perfected in war, is the key to understanding Genghis Khan's perspective on captives and slaves. To him, a slave was not a person in the way a Mongol was a person. They were not viewed as individuals with hopes, dreams, or families. Instead, they were resources. They were tools. A captive was an asset to be exploited, an object to be used until its utility was exhausted. When a city was conquered, its population was sorted like plunder. Artisans and engineers were sent back to the Mongol heartland to contribute their skills. Young women were taken as wives or concubines. Strong men were often forced into the front lines of the next siege, used as human shields, or forced to fill moats. A grim and expendable first wave. The concept of human rights, as we understand it today, simply did not exist in his mind. A slave's life had value only in relation to its usefulness to the empire. Their suffering was irrelevant. Their deaths were a calculated loss, no different from a lame horse or a broken cart. This wasn't necessarily born of pure malice, but of a cold hard pragmatism. The empire's expansion was everything, and anything that stood in its way, be it a rival army, a defiant city, or a disobedient slave, was to be removed without hesitation. The astonishing speed of the Mongol conquests was fueled by this demand for total, unquestioning control. Genghis Khan tolerated no dissent. When a city chose to resist his advance, he would often make an example of it. The gates would be breached, the population massacred, and the city itself leveled to the ground, a chilling message to any others who might consider defiance. When a tribe that had sworn allegiance to him betrayed that oath, he would hunt them down and erase them from existence, their name and people scattered to the winds. The same ruthless logic applied to slaves. A slave who failed in their duty, who showed defiance, or who simply became a burden was dealt with swiftly and brutally. The punishments were legendary, designed not just to correct the individual but to terrify all others into absolute compliance. Even seasoned Mongol warriors, men who had witnessed the horrors of 100 battlefields, were said to fall silent at the sight of the punishments inflicted upon those who failed the Khan. Think of the Mongol Empire as a vast, intricate machine, relentlessly moving forward. Every single person within it, from the highest general to the lowest slave, was a cog. Each had a specific function, a purpose they were expected to fulfill for the good of the whole. A warrior's purpose was to fight. A herder's purpose was to tend the flocks. A slave's purpose was to serve, build, or die on the front lines. And if any part of that machine, any single cog, failed to perform its duty, it was not repaired. It was crushed and replaced. There was no room for compassion or second chances. The machine had to keep moving, and the will of Genghis Khan was the engine that drove it. For those caught in its gears, especially the enslaved, life was a terrifying existence where their humanity was stripped away, and their only value lay in their service to the empire. This was the dark and brutal foundation upon which one of history's largest empires was built. These images are powerful, and they're true, but they're only half the story. For the Mongols, free men were warriors. Their purpose was to fight, to conquer, and to expand the empire's borders. When a Mongol army defeated its enemies on the battlefield, the surviving soldiers weren't just disarmed. They were often shackled and taken as prisoners of war. Their lives as fighters were over, and their new lives as property were just beginning. Men who were unskilled artisans were often put to the sword or taken for the most brutal forms of manual labor. They became domestic servants, cooks, and cleaners in the camps and households of Mongol warriors and nobles. Many were taken as concubines or wives, effectively becoming what was called household property, their lives and bodies no longer their own. This systematic capture and enslavement was not random chaos. It was a calculated policy of resource acquisition. People were the ultimate resource. The warriors would ride, scout, and fight. But who packed and unpacked the massive felt tents? The Gers, who herded the tens of thousands of sheep, goats, and horses that sustained the army. Their lives were a relentless cycle of toil. They were the invisible hands that kept the Mongol horde moving. They cared for the animals, the lifeblood of the steppe nomads. Now, not all slaves were treated equally. A hierarchy existed even within this subjugated class. At the very bottom were those assigned to the most grueling physical labor, hauling stones, digging ditches, or serving as human shields in sieges, a horrific tactic where captives were forced to the front lines to absorb enemy arrows. Their life expectancy was brutally short. Slightly above them were the domestic servants, whose lives were dictated by the whims of their masters. While they might have been spared the harshest outdoor labor, they were under constant scrutiny. A misplaced item, a poorly cooked meal, or a moment of perceived disrespect could result in a savage beating. It didn't even mean safety. A trusted servant was still a slave. A valued artisan was still property. They had no rights, no legal standing, no recourse. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of expansion and exploitation. And above all, you learned to obey every command without hesitation or question. Any sign of defiance, any hint of rebellion, was a death sentence. The psychological toll of this existence is hard to fathom. Imagine being torn from your home, seeing your family and friends killed or scattered, and then being forced to serve the very people who destroyed your world. You lived in a state of constant, low-level terror, where your survival from one day to the next depended on your ability to become invisible, to erase your own personality and become a mere instrument for someone else's will. Hope is a dangerous luxury. The legacy of Mongol slavery is complex. On one hand, it was the dark secret behind the empire's stunning success. The vast, diverse, and resentful population of enslaved people was a constant internal threat that required resources to control. Their silence speaks volumes about the true cost of conquest. Have you ever wondered what it took to survive in the court of Genghis Khan? It wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about proving your loyalty in the most extreme ways imaginable. Genghis Khan believed loyalty wasn't something you simply claimed. It was something you earned through brutal, unwavering obedience. This belief spawned a series of bizarre and terrifying rituals that slaves and captives were forced to endure, designed to break their will and remold them into extensions of the Khan's own power. These weren't just tests. They were a form of psychological warfare, and failing them often meant a fate worse than death. Imagine being presented with a bowl. It's filled with kumis, a traditional fermented mare's milk, a staple of the Mongol diet. But this isn't a gesture of hospitality. Mixed into the cloudy liquid is a special, secret ingredient, something meant to symbolize your devotion. You're a slave, captured in a recent conquest, and you're told to drink. There is no choice. Refusal meant immediate and severe punishment. Even a moment's hesitation, a flicker of doubt in your eyes, would earn you a vicious beating right there in front of everyone. This ritual was the first step. It wasn't about the taste of the drink. It was about demonstrating your complete and total surrender. By drinking without question, you were swallowing your old identity, your past and accepting that your life now belonged solely to the great Khan. It was a powerful, symbolic act of submission. The first of many you would face, but the tests didn't stop there. Another ritual was a pure, agonizing test of physical and mental endurance. Slaves were forced to kneel on the hard, unforgiving ground for hours on end, sometimes from sunrise to sunset, without moving a single muscle. Try to imagine the sheer agony, the sun beating down, the wind whipping at you, your knees screaming in pain, your back muscles spasming. Mongol records, though often brief, describe the grim reality of this test. People would faint from exhaustion, their bodies simply giving out. Others would collapse, unable to hold the position any longer. Some would even lose consciousness. To the Mongols, this wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a method of sorting the weak from the strong. Those who could endure this grueling ordeal were seen as possessing the discipline and fortitude worthy of serving the empire. Those who failed were deemed useless, their fate left to the whims of their masters. This wasn't just about physical toughness. It was about breaking the spirit, proving that you could withstand any hardship for your new lord. If you survived the kneeling, your trials were far from over. Next came the tests of bravery, or perhaps more accurately, the tests of slaves were commanded to perform incredibly dangerous tasks. One common test was to calm a wild, untamed horse. These weren't just spirited animals. They were feral, powerful beasts, kicking and biting, capable of killing a man with a single blow. The slave, armed with nothing but their wits and a desperate will to live, had to approach this creature and gentle it. Success meant you proved your courage and your usefulness. Failure could mean being trampled to death. Other similar tasks involved handling aggressive guard dogs or other wild animals captured by the Mongol hunters. The message was crystal clear. Your life was less valuable than the task at hand. You were a tool, and your bravery was measured by your willingness to be broken or discarded in the service of the Khan. And then there was the ritual of the stone. This was perhaps the most Sisyphean and soul-crushing of all the loyalty tests. Slaves were forced to carry massive, heavy stones up a steep hill over and over again. Each stone was said to symbolize the weight of loyalty, a crushing burden that you must carry without complaint. The physical toll was immense. Your muscles would burn, your lungs would ache, and your entire body would scream for rest. But there was no rest. If you stumbled, if you dropped the stone, the punishment was swift and public. You would be beaten mercilessly or subjected to intense humiliation in front of the entire camp. This wasn't just about moving a rock. It was a constant, repetitive reminder of your place. You were there to bear the burdens of the empire, to struggle and suffer in silence. Dropping the stone wasn't just a physical failure. It was a symbolic rejection of your loyalty, an act of defiance that could not be tolerated. This ritual was designed to grind you down, to erase any hope of rebellion, and instill a sense of permanent, weary submission. To our modern minds, these rituals sound like something out of a horror story. They seem extreme, sadistic, and utterly inhumane. But to understand the Mongol Empire, we have to try and understand their worldview. In the harsh, unforgiving environment of the Eurasian steppe, life was a constant struggle. Weakness was a death sentence. Genghis Khan forged his empire from a collection of warring, backstabbing tribes. Trust was a rare and precious commodity. For him, loyalty had to be absolute, unquestionable, and proven through action, not words. These rituals, as brutal as they were, served a very practical purpose from his perspective. They were a filtering mechanism. They weeded out the disloyal, the weak-willed, and the rebellious. The logic was cold and simple. Only those who could pass these horrifying tests, who could survive the beatings, the exhaustion, and the fear, were truly useful to the empire. The survivors of these ordeals were transformed. They were no longer just captives. They were broken, remade, and integrated into the Mongol war machine. Having proven their unwavering loyalty and endurance, they could be trusted with more important roles. Some might become personal bodyguards, their lives sworn to protect their master. Others might be integrated into the army, their proven toughness making them valuable soldiers. The psychological impact was profound. By surviving, they had, in a way, accepted their new reality. They had shed their old selves and embraced the identity of a servant to the great Khan. Their survival depended on their complete and utter obedience. It was a brutal but effective system of control that helped Genghis Khan build one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. The foundation of this empire wasn't just built on horseback and military genius. It was built on the backs of those who endured the unendurable and proved their loyalty through fire, pain, and stone. So the next time you hear the name Genghis Khan, remember it wasn't just about conquest on the battlefield. It was also about a conquest of the human spirit. The rituals of loyalty were a dark testament to his belief that to control a person's body, you first had to capture their will. It has a chilling look into the psychology of power and the incredible lengths people will go to survive. What do you think? Was this a necessary evil for building an empire? Or pure, unadulterated cruelty? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching! And if you found this fascinating, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. We often think of Genghis Khan as a brilliant conqueror, a military genius who united the steppes and built the largest contiguous land empire in history. But there's a darker side to his rule, one that even his most battle-hardened commanders found difficult to stomach. This is the story of how the great Khan used terror and cruelty to control those he had enslaved, a story that reveals the brutal logic behind his empire. One of the most shocking tactics Genghis Khan employed was the use of human shields. Imagine this. You're a soldier defending your city walls. You see the Mongol horde approaching, a terrifying sight on its own. But in front of them, marching towards you, is a line of unarmed people. They are slaves, captives from other conquests, driven forward with no armor, no weapons, and no hope. Their purpose was terrifyingly simple: to absorb the first volley of your arrows, to drain your resources, and to shatter your will to fight. You're forced to kill innocent people just to get to the enemy. Some of Genghis Khan's own generals protested this. They argued it was dishonorable and unnecessary, but the Khan's logic was cold and pragmatic. Every arrow that struck a slave was an arrow that didn't strike one of his own Mongol warriors. To him, the lives of his soldiers were paramount, and the lives of slaves were expendable tools. He believed this strategy saved Mongol lives, and so, despite the unease it caused, the practice continued. It was an early and brutal form of psychological warfare, designed to break the enemy's morale before the real battle even began. Genghis Khan's system of control was built on a foundation of collective fear. He understood that managing thousands of captives from different cultures, all resentful and potentially rebellious, was a monumental task. His solution was a principle of collective punishment. If a single slave in a unit made a mistake, no matter how small, spilling water, dropping a valuable item, or losing track of a horse, the punishment wasn't just for that individual. Often, the entire group would suffer. This could mean beatings, reduced rations, or worse. The goal was to create a system of self-policing, born out of pure terror. Every slave became a god for every other slave. The fear of being punished for someone else's mistake was so profound that it suffocated any thought of non-compliance. No one dared to step out of line, or even breathe the wrong way, because the consequences would be shared by everyone around them. This created an atmosphere of constant anxiety and suspicion, effectively preventing slaves from trusting one another and forming bonds that could lead to organized resistance. It was a terrifyingly effective method for maintaining order. When fear and control failed, and slaves did attempt to rebel or escape, the response was swift and merciless. Genghis Khan did not tolerate any challenge to his authority. Historical accounts from his own generals, men accustomed to the brutalities of war, describe instances of extreme retribution. If a group of captives tried to fight back or make a run for freedom, the punishment was often mass execution. The Khan would order the entire group to be put to death as a public spectacle. This wasn't just about eliminating the rebels. It was about sending a clear and horrifying message to every other slave in the empire. The message was, resistance is futile and will only lead to your complete annihilation. Even commanders who had witnessed countless bloody battles were sometimes shaken by the sheer scale and coldness of these punishments. They understood the need for discipline, but the Khan's methods sometimes felt less like maintaining order and more like pure, unadulterated terror. But his word was absolute law, and no one dared to question it openly. Beyond the public displays of brutality, there were whispers of more private, sinister places of punishment. Some Persian and Middle Eastern sources, written by those who chronicled the Mongol conquests, speak of special locations known as punishment tents or silent chambers. These were places shrouded in mystery and dread, rarely spoken of aloud. When a slave was particularly disobedient, defiant, or suspected of plotting, they might be taken to one of these tents. What happened inside was the subject of fearful speculation. It wasn't about quick punishment. It was about prolonged psychological torment. Isolation, sensory deprivation, and fear were the primary tools. The goal wasn't just to punish the body, but to shatter the mind. The mere threat of being sent to a silent chamber was often enough to ensure compliance. No slave ever wanted to find out what truly went on inside. These tents represented the ultimate expression of the Khan's power. The ability to make someone disappear from the community and break them in unseen ways. Ultimately, Genghis Khan believed that a slave with a broken spirit was far more useful and less dangerous than a rebellious one. Physical control was only part of his strategy. The other, more insidious part was psychological warfare waged against the individual. To achieve this, he often employed acts of deliberate humiliation. Slaves, who might have been proud warriors, respected artisans, or even nobility in their former lives, were forced to perform tasks designed to degrade and demean them. This could involve serving their captors in a debasing manner, performing menial labor in front of their former peers, or being subjected to rituals that stripped them of their cultural identity and personal dignity. For the Mongols, this was a calculated strategy to erase a person's past and break their will to resist. For the slaves, it was a daily experience of terror and soul-crushing humiliation. It reinforced their powerless position and made them feel less than human. Some of the Khan's own generals saw this as an extreme measure, whispering among themselves that his methods went too far. But these were only whispers. Have you ever wondered why Genghis Khan was so notoriously harsh, so unbelievably cruel? We often hear about the vast empire he built, but the stories of his brutality can be chilling. What drove a man to such extremes? To understand the conqueror, we have to look at the boy he once was. The answer isn't simple, but it's buried deep in his traumatic past. Imagine this. You're just a kid, maybe 9 or 10 years old. One day, your world shatters. Your father, a respected leader, is poisoned by rivals. Suddenly, you're not just a son. You're the head of a family with no one to protect you. This was Temujin's reality, the boy who would become Genghis Khan. But the nightmare was just beginning. In the harsh, unforgiving world of the Mongolian steppe, weakness was a death sentence. And without a strong leader, Temujin's clan saw his family as a liability. So, they did the unthinkable. They abandoned him, a mother and her young children, cast out to fend for themselves in a land where survival was a daily battle. They were left with almost nothing. They faced starvation, the constant threat of wild animals, and the bitter cold. Temujin and his brothers had to hunt marmots and scavenge for roots just to stay alive. He learned, in the most brutal way possible, that the world was a dangerous place. There were no second chances. Every day was a fight for the next meal, the next sunrise. This wasn't just a tough childhood. It was a fort. Every moment of hunger, every night spent shivering in fear. Every betrayal hammered a new belief into his young mind. He saw firsthand that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Loyalty was something to be earned, tested, and enforced, not given freely. He learned that hesitation could get you killed. One of the most famous stories from his youth tells of a conflict with his own half-brother Beg. They were arguing over a fish that Temujin had caught. For most kids, this would be a squabble. For Temujin, it was about something more. Begder was older and stronger, and he often asserted his dominance, taking food from his younger siblings. In Temujin's eyes, this wasn't just about a fish. It was about power, about survival. He saw Begder not just as a brother, but as a threat to his family's future. So, with his brother Kassar, he ambushed and killed Begder. It was a shocking act, but it sent a clear message: Temujin would not be dominated. He would be the one in control. Even his own mother was horrified. But for Temujin, it was a necessary lesson. Weakness, even within his own family, could not be tolerated. This single act tells us so much about the man he would become. He saw the world in black and white. You were either a predator or prey. And he had decided, long ago, that he would never be prey again. As he grew into a young man, his life only became more perilous. He was captured and enslaved by a rival clan, forced to wear a wooden collar like an animal. He experienced the ultimate humiliation, the complete loss of freedom. But even in chains, he was planning. He watched, he learned, and he waited. Eventually, he escaped. But the memory of that collar, the feeling of utter powerlessness, never left him. It fueled his ambition and his desire for absolute control. He vowed that no one would ever have that kind of power over him again. In fact, he would be the one to hold power over everyone else. So when we look at Genghis Khan, the emperor, the ruthless conqueror who would decimate entire cities, We're seeing the culmination of all these experiences. His worldview was forged in the crucible of betrayal, starvation, and enslavement. He came to believe that fear was a more reliable tool than love. Love could fade, and loyalty could waver. But fear was constant. Fear kept people in line. It prevented rebellions. It ensured obedience. When he demanded loyalty, he demanded it absolutely, because he remembered what it was like to be abandoned by his own tribe. The slightest hint of betrayal was met with overwhelming force, not just because he was cruel, but because, in his mind, it was the only way to prevent the chaos that had defined his youth. He believed that kindness, especially from a leader, was a form of weakness. Showing mercy could be interpreted as a lack of resolve. It could invite challenges to his authority. And for a man who had built his power from nothing, whose entire world depended on maintaining control, any challenge was an existential threat. So, he built a system based on strict discipline and unwavering law. The asa, break the law, and the punishment was severe and often final. There was no room for sentiment. This mindset extended to everyone and everything in his path. When his armies conquered a new city, the people within it were not seen as individuals with lives and families. They were resources. Skilled artisans, engineers, and scholars might be spared and assimilated into the Mongol Empire, put to work for the benefit of the Khan. They were tools, useful, and therefore preserved. But those who resisted, they were obstacles. They were a threat to order and control. And what do you do with an obstacle? You remove it. Thoroughly. The massacres that his campaigns are famous for were, in his strategic view, a logical, if terrifying, conclusion. It sent a message to the next city on his path. Resist, and you will be erased. Surrender, and you might live. It was a brutal but effective form of psychological warfare. To Genghis Khan, cruelty wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a calculated instrument of power. It was a way of imposing order on a chaotic world. The boy who nearly starved to death became a man who controlled the flow of resources across continents. The boy abandoned by his tribe created a new, larger tribe. The Mongol nation, bound together not by blood, but by loyalty to him, enforced by fear. The enslaved boy became the master of one of the largest empires in history. Of course, understanding his motivations is not the same as excusing his actions. The suffering he caused is undeniable. Millions of lives were lost. Entire cultures were wiped out. The enslaved people who built his cities and served his armies were treated as disposable. Their humanity was stripped away, and they were reduced to mere instruments of his will. The pain and terror experienced by countless individuals is a dark stain on his legacy that no amount of psychological analysis can wash away. The story of Genghis Khan is a powerful reminder of how our earliest experiences can shape us in profound and sometimes terrifying ways. The harshness he showed the world was a reflection of the harshness the world had shown him. He conquered the world because, as a boy, he had been conquered by it. He built an empire on a foundation of fear because his own life had been built on a foundation of fear. He mastered the art of survival and then turned it into an art of conquest. So, when we ask why Genghis Khan was so harsh, the answer is as complex as it is disturbing. It lies in the frozen steppes of his childhood, in the empty belly of a hungry boy, in the weight of a wooden collar on a young man's neck, and in the cold, hard logic of a survivor who vowed to never be weak again. His empire is long gone, but his story continues to fascinate and horrify us, a testament to the dark and enduring power of a brutal past. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration into the mind of a conqueror interesting, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most compelling figures. See you next time. Ever wonder what it was like to disagree with Genghis Khan? We often see the Mongol Empire as this unstoppable, unified force, a monolith of conquest. But behind the scenes, within the high command, things were a lot more complicated. The image of absolute unity, where every general marched in perfect lockstep with the great Khan, isn't the whole story. In reality, there were deep-seated disagreements, quiet debates, and a constant, simmering tension, especially on one very controversial topic: the treatment of captives and slaves. Let's set the scene. The Mongol war machine was fueled by conquest. With every city that fell, every army that was defeated, A flood of people were captured. These weren't just a handful of prisoners. We're talking about entire populations. Skilled artisans, engineers, scholars, soldiers, and countless ordinary men, women, and children. For Genghis Khan, they were a resource, a tool to be used for the good of the empire. His policies were often brutal, designed to instill terror and ensure absolute obedience. Mass executions were common, a chilling message to any who might resist. But not everyone in his inner circle thought this was the best way. Within the ranks of his most trusted generals, the men who had ridden with him from the very beginning, there were whispers of dissent. These weren't just soft-hearted ideas. These were some of the most hardened warriors the world has ever known. Their objections weren't always born from pure compassion, but from cold, hard, military pragmatism. One faction of generals, men who prided themselves on honor and discipline, believed that excessive cruelty was a sign of weakness. They argued that a disciplined army, one that treated its captives with a degree of predictability, was a stronger army. Random brutality, interview, eroded the moral fiber of their own soldiers. It turned them into undisciplined marauders rather than an elite fighting force. They worried that if their men got used to unrestrained violence against the defenseless, that lack of control could bleed over into their behavior on the battlefield or even back home. For them, a code of conduct, even in the midst of total war, was essential for maintaining a professional army. Then there was another group, perhaps even more pragmatic. These generals were a bit like risk managers. They looked at the vast numbers of enslaved people being integrated into the Mongol machine and saw a ticking time bomb. Their argument was simple. The more you brutalize people, the more you give them a reason to rebel. A slave with nothing to lose is the most dangerous enemy you can have. They advocated for a system that gave skilled captives a reason to cooperate. If an engineer, a doctor, or a master craftsman felt their life and skills were valued, they would work for the empire. But if they lived in constant fear of arbitrary execution, their only thought would be of escape or revenge. These generals saw that inspiring loyalty, or at least grudging cooperation, was far more effective in the long run than ruling through pure terror. These debates happened in the command tents, late at night, long after the dust of battle had settled. Picture it. Grizzled generals, men like Subutai, Mukale, and Jeeb, gathered around a low table. They would argue about strategy, logistics, and the fate of the people they had just conquered. One general might insist that a newly captured city's engineers be spared and put to work building siege engines for the next campaign. Another might argue for a public display of force to terrify the next city on their path into surrendering without a fight. The core of the disagreement was about control. Was control best maintained through fear or through a calculated system of incentives? Genghis Khan himself often leaned towards fear. His famous massacres, like the ones at Samarkand or Nishapur, were strategic acts of psychological warfare. He wanted the world to know that resistance was futile and would be met with utter annihilation. But he was also a pragmatist. He was the one who famously spared and recruited skilled individuals, creating a multi-ethnic, multi-talented support system for his empire. So why the harshness? It was a balancing act. But here's the crucial part. No matter how intense these debates got, no one dared to openly challenge Genghis Khan. The consequences were simply too dire. The Khan's authority was absolute, forged in blood and betrayal. Everyone in his inner circle had seen what happened to rivals, to those who questioned his final word. Old friends, even blood relatives, had been executed for stepping out of line. The memory of Jamuka, his childhood friend and later his greatest rival, was a constant reminder of the price of defiance. So, the generals learned to navigate a very fine line. They would present their arguments as suggestions, as tactical options, never as a direct criticism of the Khan's judgment. There's a famous story about the General Jeeb, known as the Arrow. Jeeb was one of the Khan's most brilliant and loyal commanders. He wasn't originally a Mongol ally. In fact, he once shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him in battle. When captured, he boldly admitted it, and Genghis, admiring his courage, not only spared him, but recruited him. Jeeb rose to become one of his top generals. One day, after a particularly grueling campaign, a punishment was ordered for a group of captives that Jeeb felt was excessively harsh and counterproductive. He voiced his concern. not in a large group, but in a more private setting with the Khan. He didn't shout or demand. He simply questioned the wisdom of the act. What happened next is a masterclass in psychological power. Genghis Khan didn't yell. He didn't threaten Jeeb. He didn't have him dragged away. He just stared at him in complete, unnerving silence. Imagine that. The most powerful man in the world. A man who could order your death with a flick of his wrist, just looking at you. His eyes unreadable. Seconds stretched into what must have felt like an eternity. The weight of that silence, of that unspoken judgment, was more terrifying than any outburst of rage could ever be. Jeeb, the fearless warrior, the man who had faced down entire armies, eventually faltered under that gaze. He broke the silence himself, apologizing and retracting his statement. The silence was the message. It said, "I have heard you. I have considered your words, and I have dismissed them. Do not raise this again." It was a chillingly effective way to maintain control. It allowed for a semblance of debate, making his generals feel heard, but it left no doubt about who had the final, unassailable authority. The lesson was learned and spread throughout the command structure. Disagree quietly, obey loudly. This dynamic reveals the true genius and the terror of Genghis Khan's leadership. He wasn't just a brute. He was a master of psychology. He understood that allowing his sharpest minds to debate ideas made his empire stronger. It brought new perspectives to the table, but he also understood that his own power had to be absolute. He created a system where his generals could argue amongst themselves, but when he made a decision, it was final. The silent stare he gave Jeeb was a more powerful tool of enforcement than any executioner's axe. So, while the Mongol horde seemed like a unified force of nature, they were, in fact, a complex organization full of competing ideas and ambitious men. The generals debated the morality and practicality of slavery, weighing honor against fear, and long-term stability against short-term terror. They were brilliant, ruthless, and pragmatic. But they all served a master whose will was law, and whose silence was louder and more frightening than any battle cry. This internal tension, this dance of debate and obedience, was one of the secret ingredients to the Mongol Empire's incredible, and often terrifying, success. Thanks for watching. If you're fascinated by the hidden complexities of history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. See you next time. How do we really know what Genghis Khan was like? It's a question that historians have wrestled with for centuries. Their chronicles are filled with tales of unimaginable brutality. They describe cities wiped off the map, populations massacred, and a leader who ruled with an iron fist. But can we trust them completely? Is it possible their hatred for the Mongols led them to exaggerate? It's a valid question. This text is a treasure trove, a unique glimpse into how the Mongols saw themselves. It was written for an internal audience, not for outsiders. Betrayal was punished swiftly and mercilessly. Disloyalty was the ultimate sin. The secret history shows a leader who forged a nation out of scattered, warring tribes by imposing a rigid, unbreakable code of law. The message is clear. Loyalty is rewarded, but defiance leads to destruction. So, while it doesn't dwell on cruelty for cruelty's sake, it confirms the foundation of his rule: fear and absolute authority. So, while any single story about Genghis Khan throwing people into pits or building pyramids of skulls might be an exaggeration, The overwhelming pattern of behavior described by a multitude of sources is not. The truth of history is rarely found in one book or one perspective. It's found in the echoes, the overlaps, and the surprising agreements between sources that should, by all rights, disagree. In the case of Genghis Khan's harshness, the echo is deafening. The truth, it seems, is that while he was a nation builder for his own people, for those who stood in his way, he was a catastrophe. Thank you so much for watching. It's a complex topic, and there's so much more to explore. What are your thoughts on how we should interpret these historical sources? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more journeys into the fascinating and often dark corners of history. See you next time. When you hear the name Genghis Khan, what comes to mind? A mighty conqueror, a brilliant military strategist, or a ruthless tyrant responsible for the deaths of millions. For many, he is a figure of extremes, a national hero in Mongolia, a monster in the lands he conquered. We see grand statues of him on horseback. We read about his vast empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. But there is a crucial part of this epic story that is almost always left in the shadows, a story that is as vast and significant as the empire itself. It's the story of the forgotten, the invisible hands that built everything. I'm talking about the slaves. Think about it for a moment. How does an army of nomadic horsemen conquer half the known world? It wasn't just through brilliant tactics and fierce warriors. It was through an immense, mobile workforce that was captured, enslaved, and forced to do the empire's bidding. These were the people whose names are lost to history, whose faces we will never see, but whose blood, sweat, and tears are mixed into the very foundations of the Mongol Empire. Their story isn't just a footnote. It's the engine that powered one of the most transformative periods in human history. And today, we're going to pull back the curtain and give them the attention they deserve. The Mongol war machine was terrifyingly efficient. When they descended upon a city, they didn't just kill and pillage. They sorted. They were meticulous organizers of human capital, artisans, engineers, scholars, musicians, and beautiful women were separated from the general population. These skilled individuals were considered valuable prizes. Blacksmiths were needed to forge weapons, engineers to build siege engines, and scribes to manage the empire's vast bureaucracy. They were sent back to the Mongol heartland or distributed among the Mongol nobility. They were the lucky ones, in a grim sort of way. Their skills bought them their lives, even if it meant a life of servitude far from home. But what about everyone else? The ordinary people, farmers, laborers, merchants, the young and the old. Their fate was far more brutal. The Mongol strategy was built on terror, but also on practicality. Why waste your own soldiers on dangerous tasks when you can use captives? So, these unfortunate souls were forced into the front lines of the next siege. They were given no weapons, no armor. Their job was to fill moats, to build ramps up to the city walls, and to absorb the first volley of arrows from the defenders. They were a human shield, a disposable wave of bodies sent to exhaust the enemy's resources and morale, before the real Mongol warriors even began their attack. Imagine the horror of being forced to attack a neighboring city, perhaps filled with people you knew, knowing you were being sent to your certain death. Life for these slaves was a constant struggle for survival. They were the ones who carried the heavy burdens, hauling supplies and equipment across vast steppes and unforgiving deserts. They dug the trenches, built the fortifications, and prepared the food for their captors. They tended the horses, the lifeblood of the Mongol army. Every mundane, back-breaking task that kept the empire functioning fell upon their shoulders. They were seen as less than human, as tools to be used and discarded. Their rations were meager, their treatment harsh, and their lives cheap. An escaped slave was a minor inconvenience. A dead horse was a major loss. That's the brutal reality they faced every single day. One of the most chilling aspects of Mongol warfare was their use of psychological tactics, and slaves were central to this. Before a siege, Mongol commanders would often parade their captives in front of the city walls. They would torture them, execute them in gruesome ways, all to send a clear message to the defenders inside. Surrender, or this will be your fate. They turned human suffering into a weapon of war. It was a strategy designed to break the spirit of resistance before the first arrow was even fired. This wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated, systematic terror, and the slaves were its unwilling performers. But the story of slavery in the Mongol Empire doesn't end on the battlefield. As the empire stabilized, it created one of the largest and most sophisticated slave trades the world had ever seen. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, is famous for reopening the Silk Road and facilitating trade and cultural exchange between East and West. But what we often forget is that one of the most traded commodities along these routes was human beings. Cities like Sarai and Astrakhan became massive slave markets. Captives from Russia, Eastern Europe, and the Caucasus were sold to buyers from Egypt, the Middle East, and even as far as Italy. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, for example, was a military dynasty founded and replenished by slaves, many of whom were purchased from the Mongols. So the very peace and stability that the empire brought to some was built on the violent displacement and enslavement of millions of others. The sheer scale of this is hard to comprehend. Historians estimate that the Mongol conquests resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. But how many were enslaved? The numbers are impossible to know for sure, but it was certainly in the millions. Entire populations were uprooted. The genetic map of Eurasia was literally redrawn as people were forcibly moved across the continent. A craftsman from Persia might end his days in the Mongol capital of Karakorum. A young woman from a Kievan Rus village might be sold in a market in Cairo. Their personal stories, their hopes, their dreams all were erased, replaced by a life of bondage. They became ghosts in their own lives, cogs in a machine they never chose to be a part of. Yet, even in this darkness, there are glimmers of human resilience. Slaves weren't just passive victims. They resisted. They ran away, they organized rebellions, and they held onto their cultures and identities as best they could. We have records of slave uprisings in different parts of the empire, and the skilled artisans, while enslaved, were also agents of incredible cultural fusion. The art and architecture of the Mongol period is a testament to this. It's a blend of Chinese, Persian, Central Asian, and European styles. This wasn't a deliberate policy of multiculturalism from the Khans. It was the direct result of thousands of captive artisans from different lands being forced to work together. They shared techniques, motifs, and ideas, creating a unique hybrid culture. In a way, their forced collaboration left an indelible mark on the world, a beautiful and complex legacy born from immense suffering. So, when we look back at the Mongol Empire, it's essential to see the whole picture. Yes, it connected the world in unprecedented ways. It fostered trade, spread technologies like gunpowder and the printing press, and reshaped the political landscape for centuries to come. Modern civilization owes a lot to this period. But we must never forget the cost. It was an empire built on conquest, terror, and the systematic exploitation of millions of enslaved people. Their labor built the cities. Their bodies filled the moats. Their skills created the art. Their suffering paid for the Pax Mongolica. Their names are lost. Their individual stories are gone, swallowed by the sands of time. But their collective experience is a vital part of our shared human history. It's a sobering reminder that progress and prosperity often have a hidden human price. The story of the Mongol Empire is not just the story of Genghis Khan and his golden horde. It's also the story of the countless nameless slaves who carried that empire on their backs. And by remembering them, we honor the full, complicated, and often painful truth of our past. Thank you for watching. If you found this story important, please like, share, and subscribe for more dives into the forgotten corners of history.